as well as intimate partner violence and abuse of the probably underage, that is less than 18 years of age, has become more pronounced during this lockdown period, which began from last year. The COVID times has not just been traumatic for all the people who are sitting at home. It has also, this frustration has given way to too much of abuse. There were news articles which came out, especially in the Western world, where the women, the wives, were being subjected to sexual abuse. So, without further ado, I would like to go on to the topic. As obstetricians and gynecologists as such, we are called in to examine a victim who is brought by the police, a sexual abuse victim, and there is a series of set of the evidence gathering that we have to follow, and it is quite an extensive procedure, and it is something that every gynecologist should be aware of, especially when they're working in government institutions. The case, the victim is brought to the nearby, either the district headquarters hospital or the tertiary hospital, and the gynecologist who is on duty is called in to examine the patient and also give our opinion and collect all the evidence which can be used further in the case and to bring justice to the victim and bring a speedy justice. So I will be doing it as a dialogue with my junior resident, Dr. Sharon. Sharon, are you there? Sharon?
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah. Okay. So by definition, what is rape? The WHO defines it as intercourse or even other forms of sexual penetration carried out against a person without that person's consent. But now it has been widened to include not just penetrative intercourse, even any other forms of either masturbation or violence against the person without the consent of the person is also brought under the definition of rape. And this is a phenomenon that has been happening over several millennia, I would say. For the basic feeling, I would say, in humans is that the males have the power to subjugate women. So this is something that has actually been seen even in olden days when wars happened between different kingdoms, and the kingdom that lost, the women of those the subjugated kingdom will be ravaged by the victors. So it was an accepted form, though a very heinous crime against women, and women were powerless to speak, and it has been going on for millennia. But where do we stand now in this 21st century? Before we go ahead, I just wanted to tell you about the magnitude of the problem. Are the problem, or is the rape coming to light? Is it being reported? In Italy, there was a National Institute, Statistic Institute, which conducted a survey, and they found that a very shocking, more than 91% of the victims did not report it to the police. So when you can see, and studies have also seen in the United States of America, more than 25% of the rape cases, that is the victims, do not report to the police. So when that is the case in women who are well educated and probably more emancipated than what is happening in the developing countries like India, you can just imagine the magnitude of the problem. So I just wanted to bring to light some of the cases that have drawn the attention of the media and that have been discussed. So in 1973, Aruna Shanbag, she was a very conscientious nurse, and she was working, and in the late shift, night shift, when she finished her work and when she was going, she was victimized and raped by her own co-worker, Sohan Lal. And after which she was actually lynched by the chain that he was having in his hand. And she did not die, unfortunately, went into a persistent vegetative state. And for 42 years, she was taken care of by her nursing colleagues in the same hospital in KEM in Mumbai. And the case of Priyadarshini Mathu, a 25 years old law graduate who was gang raped and murdered. And the Mathura rape case in 1972. This was the time when the women were not so emancipated as we have now in the 21st century, by a young 15-year-old tribal girl in Maharashtra was raped by two policemen. And the judgment was not very, it was against the girl. And finally, with a lot of hue and cry by the public, then the two policemen were then subjected to imprisonment. So what are the key points as a healthcare provider, that is a gynecologist, should we take into account when we are called in to examine the survivor of a rape victim?
So, first is the medical assessment and treatment of injuries, then prevention of pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases, followed by collection of forensic evidence, then psychological evaluation and crisis intervention and psychological support.
The Delhi High Court in 2013, after the Nirbhaya crime, that which all of you are, I think, aware of, directed all hospitals, including those in the private sector, that examination, first aid and emergency treatment to rape victims must be provided free of cost, failing which they will be facing punishment from the court of law. So this was a harsh decision given by the Delhi High Court because of the failure of private hospitals and other centers for the fear that they might be called in to provide testimony. They do not give the first aid and emergency treatment. So look at this, another 2-3 cases. Imrana's rape case, where she was raped by her own father-in-law in 2005. And this, which garnered a lot of headlines, that is Scarlett Keeling, a British tourist who had visited India, and she was raped by the locals in Mumbai in 2009. And Suzette Jordan, she was a young girl in Calcutta in 2012, was gang raped in the moving car, and she was thrown out and suffered a lot of injuries, and she died in 2015, 3 years after suffering from the injuries that she sustained. And 9 months after her death, the perpetrators were pronounced guilty and subject to imprisonment. So the charge of rape is easy to make, but like the black cat on a dark night, it is really hard to prove or hard to disprove. So it really is quite onerous on the part of the healthcare worker to collect appropriate evidence and give it so that it will be standing in the court of law and will give the right judgment to the victim. And there is a chain of custody that has to be maintained. Evidence that is collected should be appropriately labeled and should be sent so that the appropriate analysis can be done and it can be produced. So if the chain of custody and the chain of evidence is not maintained, sometimes the courts might not approve of such evidence. So it can be even worse for the victim. So what is the approach that should be followed when we are beginning examination of a victim?
So examination should be done in a systematic approach. First, consent should be obtained. After obtaining the consent, the first aid and treatment of injuries. If the injuries are grievous, life-threatening injuries, first they should be attended before getting consent. Followed by history taking and examination part. In examination part, age estimation should be done. If the victim's age is not known, it can be done with the help of physical, dental, and radiological imaging techniques. And followed by evidence collection. The evidence collected should be dry packed, sealed, and handed over to the police. Followed by the treatment aspect. Treatment aspect includes the treatment of injuries and sexually transmitted infection testing and the prophylaxis for the same, HIV testing and prophylaxis of the same, and also emergency contraception for unintended pregnancies and urine pregnancy test, followed by counseling and referral to other services if needed. Finally, document everything and hand over to the police, and then discharge and follow up.
Is consent mandatory for the examination of a rape victim?
Yes, ma'am. Consent is must. So consent should be in patient's own language. The age limit for giving consent is 18 years. According to POCSO Act, if the survivor is less than 18 years of age, the legal guardian can give the consent. If a male doctor is examining the victim, he should always accompany a female staff along with him. Also, if the victim or the legal guardian refuses to give consent, you gently explain the importance of examination.
Can we examine the victim without an FIR or the first information report?
No, ma'am. Ideally, it shouldn't be done. FIR has to be filed. If the FIR has not been filed by the relatives or the victim, you convince them and file the FIR. In most of the cases, it is the police who usually, it is the police under whose jurisdiction the crime was committed, brings the victim to the examination for evidence collection. So
how do you go about taking the history?
So all these points should be asked: whether the victim was menstruating at the time, what is the onset of puberty and the last menstrual period, whether the victim bathed or bathed after the incident or changed the clothing, because all these will erase the evidence. Similarly, whether she has passed urine or passed stool douche after the assault. In case of buccal coitus, whether she has brushed the teeth after the assault. This will erase the evidence of buccal coitus. And any history of sexually transmitted infections, any history of the incident with date, time, place, find out how injuries were found in the body were caused. Was she intoxicated with alcohol or drug or in the sense? Was there any use of lubricant or condom? History of anal intercourse and any bleeding.
So for all this collection of evidence, we have what is known as the SAFE kit. The SAFE kit actually stands for Sexual Assault Evidence Collection. It contents include a manual which will guide the doctors. It's a 21-page manual where there are several forms from number 1 to number 6, and all these forms, Form 1 pertains to consent, medical history, the sexual assault history, Form 4, the forensic examination, Form 5, general examination and age estimation, and the discharge slip. All these forms will have to have 2 copies and 4 large envelopes containing the smaller envelopes, and 11 envelopes which are usually labeled 2A to 2K, into which we have to put in all the body samples, and 8 other envelopes which are labeled 3A to 3H, so we can put in all the genital and anal samples. A stepwise arrangement of all the envelopes should be done in order to prevent any omission. What are the requirements for evidence collection?
So these are all the materials required for examination and evidence collection: paper envelopes, sterile swabs and swab gauze, bags for storing the clothes, catchment papers, comb, nail cutter, vacuum for storing blood and urine samples, syringe, needle, distilled water, disposable gloves, glass slide, a pair of small scissors, torch, microscope, colposcope, speculum, lignocaine jelly, cytofix spray, Sergi lube, spirit lamp, Toledan blue dye, and Polaroid camera. All these are a little expensive, but these are all must.
So how do you go about estimating the age of the victim? Most of the time, the victim herself will tell her age and we will have other records. But if there is a doubt as to the age of the victim, how do we go about? So yes.
Age estimation can be done with the help of TANUS staging and pubic hair growth staging. So TANUS stage 5 is the mature stage where there is projection of papilla and recession of areola, which means the victim is more than 15 to 16 years of age. Similarly, pubic hair staging, more growth of hair towards the medial surface of the thigh, and horizontal hair growth indicates that the victim is more than 15 to 16 years of age.
So what is the time limit for collection of evidence from the time of occurrence of the event?
So ideally, evidences should be collected within 72 hours, but evidences outside the body and on materials like clothing can be collected even after 96 hours. The time limit for spermatozoa is, the lifespan is only 72 hours. So 72 hours is the best time for collecting sperm as an evidence. So evidence will become weaker or disappear as the time passes, especially after 36 hours. However, depending on the jurisdiction, evidences may be collected up to 7 days after rape, and victims have the right to refuse the evidence collection. At this junction,
If they refuse collection?
I would like to say that the victim and family must be explained about the importance of evidence collection, because evidence plays an important role in revealing the victim in the court of, in revealing the assailant in the court of law. So we have to convince them.
So this principle is based on the Locard's exchange principle. Locard, Edmond Locard, who is known as the Sherlock Holmes of France, who said that every contact by a criminal definitely leaves behind a trace. So it is up to us to find every trace of evidence that is there on the victim and use that as an evidence against the assailant. So what are all the evidences that are to be collected?
First is the clothing. Ask the victim to stand in a sheet of paper, because any tiny like mud, grass, everything which falls on paper can be made out. So she has to undress both inner, outer clothes, all the clothes. And then next slide. Oral swabs in case of buccal coitus. So the posterior parts of the buccal cavity and behind the last molars, these are the places where the chances of finding any evidence are highest, and dried blood stains can be scraped off and sent. So semen is the most commonly found evidence in the scene of crime. It can be visualized using Polaroid camera, and it also emits fluorescence by ultraviolet lamp. Then acid phosphatase test. Acid phosphatase is an enzyme which is present in prostatic fluid. So when taken in a filter paper and a reagent is added, it will turn into a purple color. And it is not a diagnostic test for semen. It is only a presumptive test. Then dried seminal stains can be taken by scraping. In fingernail scrapings, so in case of defense, where the victim tries to resist the assailant, so his DNA particles, there are chances of his DNA particles to be lodged within the fingernails. So it should be taken from both the hands and both the feet and sent for DNA sampling. And blood and urine samples, in case of intoxication, this will be helpful, and saliva samples, matted pubic hair, vaginal swabs, anal swabs, saliva from the bite mark, any foreign material in the body should be taken, and any samples for DNA testing.
So if you look at the types of sexual abuse, whether it is the various types and what are the swabs to be taken. So it could be a penovaginal, penoanal, or peno-oral, or use of certain objects by the assailant, and or maybe masturbation. So always swabs will invariably include body swabs, anal swabs, oral swabs, and forensic evidence, as she has already said, is usually likely to be best found within 72 hours of the incident, but only up to a maximum of 96 hours. But even if the victim presents late, we have to try our level best to collect as much evidence as possible. So what about the swabs and the various evidence that we collect? How do we send them?
So each envelope must be labeled. So all the evidences which are collected should be placed in separate envelopes, and each envelope should be labeled as follows: the packet number, name of the hospital, place, the hospital number, date, the police station with the MLC number, name of the person with age and sex, and what is the sample collected and to which examination is going to, and the date and time of signature of doctor with seal.
So if there are signs of struggle, so how do we go about documenting all this?
These are all the signs of injury. Injury to the head, scalp, or black eye in case of contusions. And in multiple abrasions, bruise may be found over the chest, thighs, legs, and broken fingernails. And following other specimens to be collected in such case: scalp hair and all the swabs, the blood stain, swabs of the blood stain, seminal stain, the bite mark, blood and urine samples, and nail scrapings, and all the foreign material.
Should a per-vaginal examination be done as a mandatory for every patient whom we examine? No, it is definitely not mandatory, because if the evidence can be collected, then we would collect it. And if only the patient is bleeding from the vagina and we need to give medical treatment, then probably we will have to do. And it is something that the patient herself has undergone a great trauma. So as the healthcare provider, when we begin to examine, it is not mandatory to do a per-vaginal examination. What about the injuries? The description of all the orifices that were penetrated, whether ejaculation has occurred or whether a condom was used. What are the types of injuries that were sustained by the individual, particularly to the mouth, breasts, vagina, and rectum, and any bleeding from the abrasions or abrasions on the patient or the assailant, in order to assess the risk of transmission of HIV and hepatitis. All this should be seen, and the assailant's use of aggression, threats, weapons, and violent behavior, and a detailed description of the assailant also should be obtained. Coming to the time since the injury, what are the various time frames? So if you look at a fresh abrasion, it is usually reddish, but it gradually tends to become brownish and blackish over a period of few days, and then the scab happens, and then it dries off and falls off from the periphery at the end of a week. If it is a contusion, a fresh contusion may be reddish or reddish, bluish, black, but after the immediate, when the days go by, at the end of 2 weeks, it is almost undetectable. Similarly, if it is a laceration, incised lacerations and injury, fresh will usually have a hematoma. But after 24 hours, usually a scab of a dried clot might be there covering the entire area. So what about local examination? That is examination of the genital region.
So local examination. So look at the pubic hair. If it is matted or not matted, should see this first. Then look for the labia, if there is any redness, bruising, hematoma, any scratch marks. And then coming to vestibule, whether vestibule is normal or gaping is present. Then hymen. Hymen, if it is intact or torn. If it is torn, most commonly tears are seen postero-inferiorly. Then posterior foreshed, if it is intact or lacerated. And then any perineal injuries, lacerations. Then going to anal orifice, whether it is intact or lacerated. So these are all the specimens to be collected from the these areas: the pubic hair, the stains, seminal stains, blood stains, again foreign particles, any discharge, and swabs, both high and low vaginal swabs should be taken. So this is Toledan blue dye test. So Toledan blue dye is going to stain only the nucleated cells. Nucleated cells are present only in the deeper layers of the skin. The superficial epidermal layer will lack nucleus. So Toledan blue dye helps us to visualize fresh wounds, as in case of abrasions, very clearly with the naked eye. So this is an image showing extensive vaginal and rectal lacerations. In these cases, first the patient should be stabilized and catheterization, indwelling catheter should be put. The next image is showing an active vaginal bleeding in a girl with intraperitoneal bleeding in case of high vaginal tear. So these types of tears are common in gang rapes. So where the girl might need laparotomy, immediate laparotomy and exploration also.
This Mumbai gang case was before an event that was also brought to the media. the victim herself was a media person. She was a reporter who was going to this Shakti Mills in April 2014 in order to collect a story. And she was gang raped, and the reports it was a big sensation. It happened in Mumbai in April 2014. And finally, the perpetrators were brought to justice. So absence of injuries doesn't mean that there is no sexual violence. So as I said earlier itself, if there is a charge of a rape, it is the duty of the healthcare provider to take all the evidence that is available and accurately note everything and give our expert opinion. So what are the consequences?
What are all the consequences of rape?
So if we come to the examination, and the consequences of the rape can be multiple, not just physical, emotional and mental as well. So as Dr. Sabri sir was saying, it is something that the woman might go into denial mode, or she might be feeling totally depressed, and sometimes they will probably not be forthcoming when we ask the history and the events and ask them to describe the events. So it is very, very important that we are very compassionate and very sensitive to her and allow adequate amount of privacy, and then take the history and start to examine the patient. So the injuries can be extragenital injury, genital injury, the psychological symptoms that she might have, and STDs. That's the most important aspect. If it is by strangers, the chances for sexually transmitted infections like syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, or trichomoniasis, the possibility of hepatitis or HIV infection, and the possibility of an unintended pregnancy. So coming to how we would manage the victim or the survivor of the incident. The treatment basically is to give psychological support and crisis intervention, provide prophylaxis for all the sexually transmitted infections she might have acquired, do the tests for hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV, and when indicated, initiate prophylaxis for both hepatitis and HIV, and provide emergency contraception. So the routine empirical prophylaxis for STD should be commenced. Ceftriaxone injection 125 milligrams as a single dose IM to prevent gonorrhea, and metronidazole 2 grams orally as a single dose to prevent the lower genital tract infections, and doxycycline 100 milligrams twice a day for a week to prevent chlamydial infection. And for hepatitis B, if the patient has been previously vaccinated and has documented immunity, then we can avoid, but otherwise, ideally, the woman should be vaccinated with hepatitis B. And if the victim is not immunized, tetanus toxoid also should be given, because if the incident has happened in a rough and dry area outside, out in the street or somewhere like that. And post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV should be initiated within the first 72 hours. But empiric use of PEP is usually controversial. We should counsel the victim that the chance of contracting HIV from rape from an unknown assailant is only about 0.2%. But if it were to be higher, like for example, if it was from anal penetration or bleeding has happened either from the assailant or on the victim, or a male-male rape or rape by multiple assailants, especially prison victims or gang rape or rape in areas where there is a high prevalence of HIV infection, it is best to initiate post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV within the first 4 hours of the incident. And it cannot be started if the incident has happened 72 hours prior to the being brought to the hospital. And a fixed dose combination of zidovudin and lamivudin, 300 milligrams and 150 milligrams is given orally twice a day for 4 weeks if the exposure is low risk. But if it is higher, then a protease inhibitor, another third drug, is also added as a part of the PEP, the post-exposure prophylaxis. And as regards emergency contraception, so this is also something that has to be gently spoken and counseled. She should be told that there is a possibility of pregnancy. We should ascertain regarding her menstrual history and find that if the event has happened and there is a possibility that a pregnancy, unintended pregnancy may happen, then emergency contraception should be started. Levonorgestrel 2 tablets, 750 milligrams, micrograms, within the 72 hours should be given to the woman. But if she vomits, then another dose can be repeated after 3 hours. Giving the combined oral contraceptive pills like Mala D or Mala N, 2 tablets at 12-hour intervals, 2 doses can be given to prevent pregnancy. And emergency contraception can be initiated up to 5 days from the time of assault. And if she misses her next cycle, then a urine pregnancy test should be done. And if it is an unintended pregnancy, then we have to counsel her appropriately and go ahead with the medical termination of the pregnancy. So should we follow up these patients who have been brought to us? And what do we do for follow-up?
Follow-up, survivor to be called for re-examination after 2 days of assault, and then after 3 weeks and at 6th week. At 6th weeks, you have to screen her for gonorrhea, chlamydia, HPV, human papillomavirus infection, syphilis, and hepatitis. At 90 days, screen for HIV infection. At 6th month, screen for syphilis, hepatitis, and HIV infection. However, testing for STD is controversial because evidence of pre-existing STDs may be used to discredit the patient in court. And all the follow-ups should be documented clearly. And the patient, in addition to the follow-up, it is very important to see how well she is coping up with her mental trauma. So at every visit, you have to assess this also.
So this is a very important part of the documentation of the examination that we perform. It should contain, this is the format which we have to be using to document all the evidence. So the details about the patient, everything should be written down. And as you can see, it's a very elaborate form running into multiple pages. And if the woman or the victim does not understand the language, then if the woman or the victim is a special needs person, then appropriately interpreters and special educators should be brought in, and they have to be there in the presence of the police as well. And when we are getting the evidence and history from the patient. So informed consent or refusal, all that should be documented. And every, as I said, marks of identification, including the left thumb impression of the victim, everything should be written down. Her relevant medical history, surgical history, and the type of physical violence that was perpetrated on the victim, everything should be documented in detail. And the incident, as per the words of the narrator, should be documented in their own words. And whether she was under any alcohol intoxication or drug intoxication. And then we have to write down all the details regarding the sexual violence that was perpetrated. And if there is also a column of do not know. So that also can be, it is either yes or no or do not know. So all this should be completely filled. And the post-incident survivor, whether they have changed clothes, washed or bathed or douched, everything should be documented. And finally, coming to the general physical examination of the person, the victim at that time, and examination of each and every head to foot examination and documenting all our findings is a must. And the images, these 2 images will be there, and we have to write down where all we look at contusions or abrasions or any other lacerations, bite marks. Everything should be also pictorially represented here. And if a pervaginal and perspective examination should not be done unless it is required, and then looking at the oral cavity, everything should be documented. And her systems examination, the CNS, CVS, RS, everything should be documented. And if it is a male, looking at the local external genitalia of the male victim and the assailant as well, if the assailant has been brought together separately, should also be documented. And what are all the samples collected? So the body evidence as appropriate, and as I was telling, the various labeled envelopes we should write, and we should write whether we have collected them. If we did not collect, then what is the reason for not having collected it should also be mentioned. And so as you can see, regarding all that we have just said, pubic hair, the cutting of the hair, and the vulval, vaginal swabs, all that. And finally, we form our provisional medical opinion. And we'll document all the findings. And then we have completed our examination, date and time of completion of the thorough examination, signature of the examining doctor, and final opinion by the examining doctor should also be documented. So this entire copy should be in duplicate, and one medical report should be given to the survivor or the victim free of cost, in addition to the copy that we are providing to the police along with all the evidence. So this Nirbhaya case, as you all are aware, I think most of you will be aware of this case. This young girl, Jyoti Singh, in 2012, in a bus in the late nights of in New Delhi, she was gang raped. It was a heinous crime. It was a very brutal crime, wherein the woman, the victim, was subjected to severe physical violence, and the lady died after a protracted fight because of the amount of violence that was perpetrated on her and the attempted murder of her boyfriend. And it was an incident which actually shook the collective conscience of the entire nation, not just our country. It became an international media reports covering all this. And so many years, out of the 6 perpetrators, one person committed suicide in the jail while waiting, and one who was a minor was let out after a few years after being remanded in a juvenile home, whereas the other 4 perpetrators finally, after so many years, after 8 years, were hanged in as late as in March 2020. So only last year the the perpetrators were given the capital punishment. So you can see, when in spite of so much of media and publicity and so much of drives by the various women's organizations and other organizations, the justice takes so long, and the mental trauma that the family has had undergone over so many years. So justice delayed is actually justice denied, isn't it? So we should always say, no more
shielding of
the rapists. So this is something, a hashtag that is there, and it has to be, as healthcare providers, we have to definitely try and, as far as possible, be very objective and collect all the evidence and continue or maintain the chain of evidence and see that it is admitted in the court of law and the perpetrator is, punished. And it should be a fast track kind of a court which deals with these kind of cases. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am, you can stop sharing your screen, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, Dr. Vijayalakshmi, ma'am, and Dr. Sherin from the Department of Psychiatry for giving such an elaborate, in-depth, and covering almost all points that are needed to be known about examination of rape victim. You've elaborately covered the assessment of a rape victim, about forensic evidence, and most importantly, the victim's consent for examination, and about crisis intervention, about the treatment of injuries, treatment of STDs that are contracted in the process, how to prevent these pregnancies, accidental pregnancies, and also other physical support that are needed for such victims. So, thank you, ma'am, and thank you, Dr. Sharon. Ma'am, we have a few queries here in the chat box. Others who have queries on the topic can also unmute yourselves and ask. There is one question, ma'am. How to prove that a person is a rape victim if history is unavailable? Like some people can also have can report with alleged signs of rape or sexual abuse, which can be for some kind of secondary gains or for compensation purpose. So, how to differentiate such an alleged victim from a real rape or sexual abuse victim? That is a query from one of the participants.
See, I would actually say that, see, this is something that the victim has undergone, the person has undergone, and it is not something that any woman will make a false claim, which because it is actually going to open her to so much of the scrutiny, not just by us, by the police, and by if the media catches wind of it, the media. So when such a it's I would say it's a great emotional trauma and the mental trauma that the woman is undergoing, and we cannot say that it is not something that a woman would easily allege someone to have raped her. And so when we suspect that it could not have been there, then it is we have to collect all the evidence that is available. And if she has laid a claim on a particular assailant, we take all the evidence, like I had just described, all that, and send it across. And it is for the court of law to, then further proceed. So we can only be very objective. We can only look at all the findings and provide it to the police officials. And from there, regarding whether it is a false allegation and all that, I think after listening to such a big lecture, there is even if it is, we have come to the state where even if it is a husband who forces himself on his wife is taken as rape, the courts have ruled that to be rape. That is intimate partner violence, intimate partner rape. So it's not something that women will make a claim or will make such allegations. So that's what I want to say. But we should be objective. We will provide all the evidence to the police. And we have no further say in that matter over and above this. Collect evidence, provide it to the police. That's all.
Thank you, ma'am. As you had already explained in your slides as well, that charge of rape is easy to make, but it's not easy to prove or disprove.
Prove or disprove, yes, yes.
So the same person has asked, does any act exist against any false accusation of rape? To my knowledge, it is not there. I'm not sure if there is any.
Yeah, that is, I think, a question which a lawyer should probably take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's one more query, ma'am, from the participant. If patient wants only first aid, treatment of injuries, and contraception from us, and if the patient is not willing to involve herself in police or judicial system, should we still go ahead and inform the police? Or what is the essential documentation that needs to be done to save ourselves, the doctors, from the legal or judicial system?
If the woman comes to us and seeks, if there is a claim, and if she makes an allegation that it is that she has been subject or she has suffered, she's a victim of sexual violence, then we, as I said, there is an informed refusal. The patient can refuse to give other evidence that we will be collecting. But as I said, it's a very sensitive issue. We have to make an MLC. It is mandatory from our part to make a medical legal entry, call the police in that jurisdiction under which it comes under, inform it to them, and collect the evidence. So collecting evidence, we will have to very gently put it across to her. Probably she is in denial or she is traumatized by the event now when it is, in the immediate aftermath. And when she is probably counseled appropriately by her either family members and lawyers, she will then get the courage to come out and speak out. So at that time, when the time is gone, there is no way we can prove the case. So we should try as far as possible counsel her appropriately, collect the evidence, and counseling and very, very that is very important at this juncture, especially when she comes like this, saying that she doesn't want to press charges.
Okay. So, thank you, ma'am. As you say, there is time is very important in this case, and time once lost,
for evidence
we can't
collection
go back and collect the evidence. Yeah, that's
true.
yeah. True. Yes, ma'am. So, if the victim is not mentally sound to give consent, or if there is no legal guardian, can we still proceed with the examination?
Yes, we can proceed with the examination. A court order should be brought. So the police will look at that. They will take care of the legal aspect of it. They will bring the order from the magistrate and ask us to go ahead with the examination of the mentally, the individual, the victim.
So even if such a victim is brought by the family members, we should go ahead with the examination and inform the police, and then from them we have to get the legal proceedings. Okay.
If the family members are there, we'll have to talk to them, because probably the victim is not in a state of mental frame to give consent, but we can get consent from the family members. Okay. But if they have no family members, and if, as that question was posed, was whether when there are no family members and when the victim is also mentally unsound, it is the state's duty. So it is the duty of the police to get the appropriate consent from the magistrate, and we have to proceed ahead with because this is a crime that has been committed. Okay. Please understand, it is a crime. We cannot sit back and say just because that the victim is not going to give consent, and just because they have nobody else to give consent for that particular lady or woman, we are not going to collect evidence. We have to collect. All the more, these are the kind of cases where we have to leave no stone unturned to collect evidence and bring the perpetrators to justice.
Okay. So there have been few instances when we get patients in our OPD, ma'am, psychiatry OPD, when victims walk in, there have been few instances where they have not reported to the gynecological OPD. They have directly come here for complaints of, extreme anxiety or sleep disturbance, and coming to us seeking for treatment for that. When we inquire further, we come to know that they have not visited the gynae OPD for examination or collection of evidence. So in that situation, how do we deal with it, ma'am? We have all this while we have sent them to the gynae OPD for the examination, collection of evidence, and for further medical legal proceedings. So any other suggestions from your side to deal with such issues, ma'am?
See, actually, it should be a multidisciplinary approach when it comes to such an event, such a situation. And probably when the victim is seeking help from the psychiatry department, they might have come or will come to you a few days or even a month or something like that after the incident has happened. So in such a case, there is very, very, there's no way we're going to gather any kind of physical evidence, isn't it? So if you are able to ascertain from her history that she has probably been violated and the event has happened in under 1 week, then we can probably, you can refer her to us, and we can examine her and take a thorough history and look for certain evidences probably at the place where the incident happened and all that. But all that will be the work of the police. But we can try and gather at least any minimum amount of the evidence that we can get. But as we had already pointed out, if she's going to reach us after a week or more than that 96 hours, that she's bathed and douched and all that, we are not going to. So probably, if possible, the clothes that she wore at the time that the event happened, if she has those, then we can try and get that as physical evidence possible. We can try to get. That is what we can do. So probably when in your department, if you encounter some women coming back to you with the anxiety disorder and panic attacks and all that, and those type of or any somatization disorder or anything like that, it might be probably post a sexual assault. Then you can call us in and we can talk to her, try and get some more history from her, and try and collect some physical evidence as possible.
Okay. Yeah, okay, ma'am. Thank you. Are there any more queries from the participants? You can unmute yourself and go ahead with your queries or comments, or you can type in the chat box as well. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Vijayalakshmi, ma'am, and thank you, Dr. Sherin. Thank both of you for your extensive covering of all the physical aspects of how to examine and treat rape victim.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sherin. Over to Dr. Mridula.
Participants, kindly keep your mics muted. And any queries, please drop it in our chat box below.
We have the second session in just few minutes. So as Dr. Vijayalakshmi in the previous session had clearly mentioned that absence of injury does not mean that there has been no sexual violence. So there is a significant group of people, even without physical injuries, when they come to us, there is significant psychological trauma. And after the event has happened, it continues for, weeks to months to year. Even after the event has happened, it will continue to trouble the victim. So we have our second speaker, Dr. Shankar. Dr. Shankar, are you there?
Hello, Shabi.
Yeah. Yes. It's a little unclear though. If you can increase you can make the audio clear in any way.
Audible now?
Yeah, you're audible, but a little faint. If you can use your earphones.
Okay, I'm using the iPod only. Now?
It's a little less audible. You are audible, but it's not very clear.
Just a second, I will change to iPhone.
Yeah. Sure. So participants, kindly stay muted throughout the session so that we don't have any audio difficulties or clarity issues. whatever queries or comments or suggestions that you have, please post in the chat box. At the end of the session, you can also unmute yourself and go ahead with your queries and suggestions.
Shabi, now?
Yeah, now
Is
it's
it loud?
better. Yes. It is loud and better.
Okay. Very good. Okay.
So we have our second speaker for the day, Dr. Shankar. Dr. Shankar is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry in Government Mohan Kumaramangalam Medical College Hospital, Salem. He has finished his undergraduation from PhD Institute of Medical Sciences and Research, Coimbatore, and he got his MD Psychiatry degree from Madurai Medical College, Madurai. After his post-graduation, he went on to be a DMHP psychiatrist for quite some time at the government headquarters hospital, Namakkal. And he was also an assistant professor in the government Dharmaburi Medical College Hospital before joining as assistant professor in Salem. He has a lot of published papers to his credit in various journals, national and regional and international journals. He has Professor Dr. Balanvi Award for the best postgraduate research paper added to his credits, and under his guidance in the medical college hospital, many undergraduates and postgraduate medical students have won various first and second prizes in state level, zonal level psychiatric quiz competitions. He is very good academician, and his field of interests are neuropsychiatry, personality disorders, and genetics in psychiatry. So we have Dr. Shankar to speak on the psychological issues of both the sexual abuse victim as well as the perpetrator. So hope this will be a feast to the audience participants. So over to you, Dr. Shankar. You can go ahead with the session.
Thank you, Shabiba. Can I share my screen?
Sure, yeah.
Is it visible, Shabiba?
Yes. You can make it in full screen so that it will be visible.
Yeah.
Yes, you can
Okay.
go.
Thank you, Shabiba. Good afternoon to one and all. Myself, Dr. Shankar, assistant professor from Salem Medical College. Today, for this CME, I'm going to discuss about the psychiatric aspects of sexual abuse. I would like to thank Chettinad Medical College Psychiatry Department for providing this opportunity. Today, exclusively, I will speak only the psychiatric aspects of sexual abuse or sexual assault. I will not discuss anything in general about the sexual assault. In this pandemic era, we are going to discuss a more than a pandemic thing, that is sexual assault for women, children, and few other group of peoples. Most of the time when we think that sexual assault means it is towards women, but nowadays after the POCSO Act, it has been given much importance to children with sexual abuse. But there are some of the other group of people that has been neglected in sexual assault, including towards men, towards gender minorities group, and of course towards elderly peoples and immigrants also. So sexual abuse is not only pertaining to a particular group, it is so wide and it is endemic, or even it is more than pandemic. So the psychiatric sequelae that following a sexual abuse is more traumatizing for them than the event per se. So with this intro, I will start my presentation. So this is the introduction in relation to the psychiatric aspects. Sexual related offenses are a universal phenomena which takes place in every society. Sexual offenses aptly take the form of violence, which sometimes causes severe irreparable damage to the physical and mental health of the victims. It increases the feeling of helplessness and powerlessness in the victim. it is likely that the fear of sexual violence in women will restrict their freedom and occupational opportunities and affect their long-term psychological well-being. So the definition given by WHO for sexual violence is the one which I will skip. So coming to the etiological explanation, why an individual develops a psychiatric symptom or a psychological consequences following a sexual assault. So this etiological explanation will give you a clear idea to how to intervene, where to intervene, when to intervene, etc. So the etiological I have categorized into ecological and neurobiological. So coming to the etiological perspective, there are many factors that may be responsible for development of an illness. In general, the nature of the assault itself, how long it lasted, the extent of physical harm, the victim's relationship to the perpetrator, whether the victim has had an earlier childhood history of abuse or neglect, how the family environment will react and respond to it. So then this is a broad heading: ecological, theoretical perspective, and neurobiology. So in this two way, I will discuss the etiological consequences. So Brof and Brenner has categorized a theory called etiological theory. This is his model: individual, assault, microsystem, mesosystem or exosystem, macrosystem, and chronosystem. So according to him, individual factors, which include socio-demographic, biological, genetic factors, which will be dealt as separately in neurobiology, assault characteristics, which include victim-offender relationship, injury, alcohol use. Microsystem is nothing but family and friends for that particular victim. A meso-exosystem is contact with the legal, medical, mental health, and rape crisis centers. Macrosystem is nothing but the society and community. A chronosystem is nothing but chrono time. It is over the period of time, how the individual has gone through re-victimization or how the individual survived. That is called chronosystem. And the self-blame is a term which has been conceptualized as a meta-construct, because this self-blame which acts at multiple levels to create a psychological trauma. See, the first individual level factors, victim and assault characteristics. Though the age, race, income, education, employment has not a direct relationship towards psychiatric consequences, but it has mixed findings. Whereas assault characteristics, particularly of offender relationship, physical injury, alcohol use, and biological factors increase in cortisol level also have direct link to the psychological symptoms. A personality trait of an individual, particularly neuroticism, predicts PTSD, and poorer pre-assault mental health as well as avoiding coping strategies. These can result in more psychiatric disturbances for them. In the similar way, microsystem, that is family and the friends, if there is a poor social relationship or support from the family, then there is a high likelihood of developing a psychiatric illness. On the contrary, if they show a good support, then the individual will have good recovery without developing any psychological sequelae. Meso or exosystem, that is a legal system. Most of the time in our country, this system is a major drawback, because apart from the POCSO, the sexual assault the victim will have a very difficult in going through the legal procedures that made them a secondary victimization and repeatedly traumatizing them, which made a risk of developing into a psychological disorders for them, particularly PTSD and depression. So rape crisis centers, other community mental health programs might all help the individual to mitigate the effects. If those are not available for the individuals in the exosystem, then the individual are highly likely to develop into psychiatric consequences. Macrosystem is culture, community, so how they are treated. So all these things, if it is not in a good culture, good state, then again they are at risk of developing into psychiatric illnesses. A chronosystem is nothing but over the period of time, how the individual gone through, particularly they have cumulative trauma and re-victimization over the lifetime, predicts negative outcome towards psychiatric illnesses. Self-blame, as previously said, self-blame acts at multiple level, towards individual level, then microsystem, that is family level, then mesosystem level, legal system, then macrosystem, community level. Everywhere, if it is occurring, then the individual are more vulnerable. So these are the ecological perspective, how the individual after trauma getting into a psychiatric sequelae. And similar to this, there is a model proposed by a Finklaw Brownie for a child sexual abuse, that is called traumatogenic model. where the child, after going through sexual abuse, will have a powerlessness and disempowerment towards their life. And traumatic sexualization, they do not know how to go about to their sexual life when they become an adolescent, and betrayal from the known persons and the negative connotations, particularly badness, shame, guilt, all these things can cause a deteriorating self-image of the child. So this results in more problematic for their future. So they will land up with more psychiatric sequelae when they develop into an adolescent and adults. And one more group which I have mentioned is gender minorities, that is LGBT group. So this group has been completely neglected when we talk about abuse, because transgenders and men to men abuse, there are so many abuses are there because of stigma, they are not coming out. So there are risk factors why these individuals can also go for psychiatric illness, because internalized homophobia in the society make more vulnerable because they won't even comment about it. Discrimination in the society, the history of sexual abuse during adolescence, and there will be no support from the family and the friends when they become an LGBT group, and environmental risk factors like social isolation and poverty. All these things made these minority groups are more vulnerable to develop into psychiatric illnesses when they encounter sexual abuses. When they are in minority group communities together, there allow protective factors for them. So coming to the neurobiological aspect in response to a sexual trauma, there are three important structures, particularly amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. These are the three structures that are taken control when the individual gone through trauma. Yes, the first part of the brain to be activated is amygdala, and it detects a signal and gives a freeze reaction to the individual. During that time, the individual doesn't know what to do, and the individual is literally in a freezing state. Rarely the sexual assault victim takes a fight and flight reaction, because most of the time when they take a fight or flight reaction, they will know that they will land up with physical injury, or they will have fear that that particular perpetrator might harm her, or they may damage her. So in that way, the sexual assault victim rarely takes fight and flight. Mostly they will freeze. So this is a first step in neurobiological. And once the trauma occurred, there will be a problematic in memory, coding, and storage, registration. All these things will have changed. For example, if after a trauma, the registration in the hippocampus has been completely impaired. This is the reason where the victim is not able to recollect most of the events that happened during trauma. So the trauma directly affects the registration of memory, particularly in the hippocampus, which in turn affects recall of the memory. In the same way, there is something called flashbulb memories. You know what flashbulb memories occur because of the adrenaline and noradrenaline that is released during the fight and flight reaction. So that helps individual to store some important events of that particular act. So that time the individual may be able to recollect some of the memories, that is called flashbulb memories. The remaining part of the memories the individual doesn't remember during the act. So to sum up, the brain area involved in neurobiology of sexual trauma is hippocampus, amygdala, and prefrontal cortexes. And the neurochemicals that has been implicated include adrenal hormones, particularly norepinephrine, glucocorticoids, and BDNF. All this has been implicated. Ultimately, the individual, if repeatedly gone through the stress, or if they have poor coping mechanisms, or if they have poor family or support system, they will land up with dysregulation of hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis that heralds the that actually starts the onset of major psychiatric illnesses, and that is the main reason. So one more thing which we never think in this way, because gene environment interaction has a role here in traumatized individual. Yes, there are certain genes as a direct link. If they get traumatized, sexual trauma or any other severe trauma, if the individual possesses this gene, they may develop psychiatric illness. What are the such genes? What are the genes that have such risk? One is serotonin transporter or promoter region, then another one is BDNF gene, then COMT gene, serotonin transporter gene, then corticotropin releasing hormone receptor gene, FKB506 binding protein gene. So these genes, any change, any different allele from the routine, has more risk of developing into a psychiatric illness when they gone through a trauma. So the individual characteristics is this one. So that's all in the etiological consequences. Now we'll move on to the main portion, that is psychological consequences of sexual abuse. Yeah. So in this, the anxiety, depression, PTSD, all are not same as a routine anxiety, depression, or PTSD, because these individuals have a specific set of symptoms. These individuals are very, very difficult to diagnose. The individual very difficult to come out and difficult to give up, or difficult to they'll tell that they are having the illnesses. So there we need a separate classification system. As of now, there is no separate classification system for these kind of disorders, but still they incorporated into the major classification like ICD-10 or DSM, but we need a separate classification system for rape trauma survivors. So among the psychiatric disorders, PTSD stands first, most common, followed by depression, anxiety, alcohol dependence, and many other disorders. Almost all the psychiatric illnesses can occur following trauma, rape trauma, or any sexual trauma. So most of the time the individual, the psychiatric symptom occurs within 3 months of the post-assault, but very rarely the consequences, chronic consequences proceeds. So this is the classification of a psychological consequences. It could be acute, medium or long term, or others. So acute, these are the acute state, acute psychiatric states. What are the acute? The patient will go for a denial, shock, they will have isolation or withdrawn, they will have acute stress reaction, suicidal behavior, the dissociative conversion disorders, very rarely acute psychosis, and there is a syndrome called rape trauma syndrome. And in the long term, a medium long term, medium, the individual have depression, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse. But in long term, the most threatening one is PTSD, eating disorders, borderline personality disorder in case of child sexual abuse, sleep disturbances, body dysmorphic disorder, sexual dysfunction, and relational difficulties. See, so you all, many of the students, if they are psychiatric postgraduate or psychiatrists, they will aware that the symptoms of acute stress reaction, initially there will be a constriction of consciousness, narrowing of attention, and the individual will be disoriented that time. We have severe anxiety with panic-like feature, or there may be a depersonalization-like symptom, which usually present within minutes following a trauma, and it usually lasts for 2 to 3 days. If an individual have a acute stress reaction following a sexual assault or trauma, definitely the individual is more prone for developing a depression or PTSD in the future. So dissociative conversion disorder is also very common. Most of the time, dissociative identity disorder, depersonalization, derealization can occur, and next most is dissociative amnesia, also very, very common with these group of peoples. And functional neurological symptom disorders like pseudo seizures and paralysis is also very prevalent in acute phase. So the acute psychosis is very rare with a rape trauma victim. So hallucinations, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized catatonic behavior. So these are the classical symptoms of acute psychosis, usually occur within a day, and they can be lasted for less than a month, are also called brief psychotic disorder. So this is a rape trauma syndrome. There is no separate diagnostic guidelines for this. It is a separate terminology given in the many articles and many literatures. So the rape trauma syndrome is categorized as 3 phases: acute, integration, and chronic phases. The acute phase is the initial. It is similar to a acute stress reaction where the individual will have expressive features like shaking, crying, yelling, or a controlled such as flat-handed affect, appearing outwardly calm and subdued. So this is the initial phase. Then the second phase, the individual will have integration phase, where the patient tries to come outward and tries to adjust with the society, tries to live in a normal way, and the final phase is long-term reorganizations. The individual will go for long-term reorganization. That is the final phase. It's called rape trauma syndrome, acute, integration, and chronic. So coming to the medium and long-term complication. Before getting into this medium long-term complication, I would like to tell one thing. Most of the time when we discuss about a sexual assault, sexual trauma, we think only it is a rape, it is by a stranger, it is very aggressive, it is very violent. No, not at all. That percentage of rape is very, very, very less. Most of the time, this kind of sexual assault or abuse are from the known people within the family context, within the community, within neighbor group, or in the occupation, etc. So when this kind of sexual abuse or assault happening in the neighbor areas and family and friends, then these kind of acute complication will never occur. These individuals are more likely to have medium and long-term complications than the acute complications. That acute complications very common with the rape by a stranger, etc. So usually we think a sexual assault means in that way. That's why I was telling in between. So now move on to long-term, medium and long-term complication. One is depression and suicide. Suicide can be immediately aftermath of the abuse, or can be occur when the individual gone through a depression or when in PTSD symptom. So you all know that depression will have depressed mood, loss of interest, enjoyment, etc. And the individual will have the following symptom as an additional symptom like guilt, unworthiness, pessimistic views, hopelessness, helplessness, reduced self-esteem, etc. Usually for a depression, we need 2 weeks diagnosis, and this is also a second most common disorder in rape trauma or sexually abused victim. Anxiety. So anxiety, particularly phobic anxiety disorder or GAD, where the individual worrying everything in relation to the sexual trauma or anything related to that particular perpetrators, anything related to that individual love provoking. So panic attacks, phobic anxiety disorders are very common, followed by GAD and mixed anxiety depression, also present as a medium level complications. And the most common one is PTSD as a long-term sequelae. So the classic 3 symptoms of PTSD are flashbacks, avoidance, and hyperarousal. Flashback is nothing but a repetitive reliving of the trauma with intrusive memories or dreams. Avoidance of activities and situations are reminiscent of the trauma. In relation to the trauma, the individual avoid getting into, for example, if the trauma happened in the occupation, the individual stops going to the job. If it has happened in the neighborhood, the individual stops going outside. So the avoidance. And hyperarousal, when they think about or suddenly the individual will have hyperarousal situations. Usually it starts from few weeks to months. It rarely exceeds 6 months. Some individual will go on through a long chronic course and have an enduring personality change. RRPTSD is a term, is called rape related PTSD. And one more most important thing you are going to see is a term called complex PTSD. Before getting into the consequences, psychological consequences, I was informed that I discussed that a separate classification system is must. At least if separate classification system is not there, we can incorporate a subtype in a major classification. One among this is complex PTSD, which has been given in ICD-11. Yes, in ICD-11, they have given a complex PTSD disorder as a separate diagnostic guideline, where a rape trauma survivor has been given as an example. What is the difference between the PTSD and complex PTSD? In the complex PTSD, the individual will have a routine PTSD symptoms. Along with that, the individual will have a severe pervasive problem in affect regulation. There will have persistent belief about oneself diminished, defeated, worthless, accompanied by pervasive feeling of shame, guilt, or failure related to trauma. And the individual have persistent difficulties in sustaining the relationship in feeling close to others. So this is one I was discussed. So a separate diagnostic guideline, if it is not available, they can be categorized as subcategory. Then other miscellaneous disorders that can occur is sleep-related, trauma-related sleep disorders, particularly nightmare, sleep paralysis, night awakening, restless leg syndrome, this can, and BPD. So BPD is not very common in adults because adults already the personality has been developed. In CS, child with sexual abuse, however, the most important etiology for BPD is a childhood sexual abuse. Yes, most of us know about this. Classical feature of BPD is a pervasive pattern of instable in affect regulation, impulse control, interpersonal relationship, self-image, and difficulty in controlling the anger. So children with sexual abuse survivor are more likely to have a borderline personality disorder in near future. What are the other disorders? Psychiatric disorders, somatoform disorders, body dysmorphic disorders. Sometimes extreme body piercing can occur with following trauma, and negative health repercussions like GI distress, chronic pelvic pain, substance abuse, high utilization of health services. So these are some of the other disorders. I have highlighted, though these are not a classical psychiatric illness, there are some of the psychological problems for these individuals. No, though that is not a direct disorder, I have mentioned in the upcoming slides. What are those things? First one is relational difficulties. What do you mean by that? Following a trauma, the individual have a long-term problem with disruption in interpersonal relationship and difficulty in intimacy, and have a communication difficulties is most of them. and display impaired social behavior that include mistrustful, avoiding relationship, or paradoxically, they will constantly seek the relationship. So this is relation difficulties. Sexual difficulties, of course, the individual have a confused sexual orientation, have experienced sexual dysfunction, possess a fear about the sex, and some individual might develop disorders like dyspareunia, vaginismus, menstrual irregularities, and chronic pelvic pain also. What are the other pregnancy and parenting issues? Here, the pregnancy is nothing with because of trauma, consequences, or a complication. It is not like that. A pregnancy and parenting issue means that is a pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation can again trigger the PTSD symptoms because the pain that the individual go through during labor will actually precipitate PTSD, will have an hyperarousal, will have a flashback memories. In the same way, if the child, that is the most important for a child and mother, is a bonding, breastfeed bonding. So that instead of getting bonding, the individual will have intrusive memories about the trauma. So this is the biggest problem for them. They have a difficulty in parenting also, because most of the time a sexually abused individual more likely to become a perpetrator than a victim and can again cause damage to the children. That is called as intergenerational transmission of abuse. This is a newer term for you. Yes, there are some parents who have experienced sexual abuse or an assault or maltreatment can go on mistreat their own children. So this phenomena actually incorporates the element of both the survivor likelihood for re-victimization and the subsequent parenting practices. So these are the major group of psychiatric illness I have classified as acute, medium, or long-term complications. Almost same complaints occur for the person with disability who is getting abused, or person with gender minorities, or person with the elderly population, and person with children also. But there are some separate extra indices for children. Behavioral indices. What are the extra behavioral indices apart from the primary group of psychiatric disorders? That is called accommodation syndrome. I will discuss in the next slide. Sexualized behavior. The child started behaving in sexualized way. Avoidance of specific adults. The individual have nightmare, sleep disturbances, clingy behavior. They may have separation anxiety, fearfulness, bedwetting, etc. There are school refusal. The last three, that is school refusal, decreased scholastic performance, medically unexplained symptoms. These three symptoms actually indicate you of a sexual assault. If your child having these three, suddenly you should think that something is fishy. This is called accommodation syndrome. Summit and Ronald classified this a newer term. It is not a classical psychiatric disorder where there is a steps of child sexual abuse. The child will have initially keep it as a secret. They will feel helpless, entrapped, and later conflicted, unconvincing disclosure will be discussed. And after the disclosing, the child will have retract the disclosure. So what will happen each step the individual will have an extreme form of anxiety, and at last during retraction they will have depression also. This is called child abuse accommodation syndrome. And so far I have not discussed what happens to men when they are abused. Usually they are not usually and not most not commonly abused. Men are not abused, but rarely men also being sexually abused by another man. So woman usually not abuses men sexually. It's not possible, but some rarely it happens. During that time, what will happen for them? Do they have same kind of psychiatric illnesses like the abusers for women victims similar to that? Yes, the men abuser will have the men victim will have more psychiatric trauma than a women victim, because the reason is men will be considered as a strong and a strong person in the society. So if they get abused and everyone knows about that, everyone will give stigmatized word, or everyone blame them like anything. So what happens for that? The individual will have more psychological consequences than women victim, and these individuals will have more externalizing issues like substance abuse, irritability, aggression. These kind of symptoms will be more than internalizing symptoms like anxiety and depression, which will be more common with women victims. So that's all in psychological consequences. Next we move on to disclosure, then assessment, then we will move on to further topics like treatment and perpetrators. So disclosure, victim disclosure. And I have put two slides only, one for adult, one for victim. So if somebody discloses to you, so how you should behave. So you should listen attentively, believe the person, do not show judgment through your reactions and questions, comfort the person, make it clear that the perpetrator is at its fault, determine if the person is in danger or has a thoughts of a suicide. Find out what resources are available in that region, and if necessary, refer the person to them. Seek support for yourself if needed. And in case of children, what you have to do, minor, in case of minor, takes the time to listen. Reassure the child that you believe him or that what happened is not the child's fault. Avoid asking leading questions that might influence the child's answer, taint his or testimony. Try not to judge or react strongly. Write down what the child says and the context in which the abuse was disclosed, and do not promise to keep what the child said as a secret. Tell the child that you have to share the information with the people whose job is to keep children safe. So immediately report the situation to the child welfare officers or the police. So that's all in disclosure. Now we move on to the next important psychiatric assessment of the victim. I was discussing only about the victim. After completing the victim, I will start discussing about the perpetrators. So assessment of victim. So when and where the mental health professionals encounter, yes, as a direct presentation of psychological distress, the individual can directly come with the psychiatric disturbances. Later, they reveal that they have gone through sexual abuse or trauma, or being brought by law enforcement agencies for legal opinion. This is not very common. But once they come, you should respect for autonomy, do beneficious, no harm, non-maleficence, and right to health, right to dignity, right to information, right to privacy, right to confidentiality, right to safety, and right to assistance. There is a interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary team to should involve evaluation, and you have to get an informed consultation. Whether the individual referred by a court or whether the individual came by on its own, you should do a routine examination with detailed documentation, because anytime the court may ask you to come for a witness. So always when you encounter a sexually abused victim, mental status related thing is very, very important. Sometimes it will change the judgment itself. So mental status examination of an adult victim, because in cross examination many a times the the public prosecutor or the person who is cross examining you will constantly question related to the mental issues only. So they will constantly how they give a given consent, and how they what they do they know about the sexual relationship or not, do they know about whether pregnancy can happen or not, like this only they will ask. So you should document whenever you encounter. So routine MSc, a current emotional status, indicator of self-harm, suicidal gesture, a presence of potential weapon, and of course a past history of self-injurious behavior also very important, because it is the most important risk factor for the current suicide attempt. These are some of the red flag signs which needs immediate warrantation, red flag signs. So some of the red flag signs which include demographic information, red flag signs, suicidal behavior, stupor state, severe depression, psychotic symptoms, substance use, PTSD, a client with psychosocial disability, high emotional distress, high level of disorganization, and poor social support. All these things make the individual at risk for mental health. Immediate intervention required, either admission or immediate intervention with psychotherapy or pharmacotherapy. So documentation, as previously discussed, you should be thorough in documentation. Rating scales can also be employed. The rating scales like trauma, symptom inventory, which has a 100-item scale. Some of the items such as being given like anxious arousal, depression, etc. So these kind of scales can be used to assess the psychiatric morbidity in those individuals. So other scales like scale for perceived social support, scale for scoping, and there are scales specifically used for trauma situation like depressive scale, which is called a Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale for children, and the same for adults also. In the same way for anxiety, there are separate scales for the trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder also have a brief rating scale for PTSD among sexual violence victims. So you can apply scales for assessment. Then what other thing you require in assessment? Yeah, if court has asked you whether the victim has a capacity, so you have to assess in the two way. First, whether the individual have a mental disorder or not, or there is an impairment in capacity. So impairment in capacity, how will you know that the individual has impairment in capacity? One, these are the following. The patient must be unable to understand the information relevant to the decision. remember the information relevant to the decision, weighing up the advantages and disadvantages, and be able to communicate that decision. So if it is present in that particular individual, then the individual have capacity, impairment in capacity. So that can be discussed in two ways. How will you assess in questioning? One is assessing the capacity of victim to give evidence or statement in the court. That is called competence to give evidence. Assess the capacity of the victim to consent of a sexual relationship. So among these two, the point number one commonly asked by the court. The point number two, so far they will never ask, but I have added here. So competence to give evidence. Could the nature and extent of witness mental health condition affect his or understanding, perception, and recollection of the incident? Ability to recall, accurately interpret the events, or the ability to consistently tell the events. Quality of short and long-term memory. So again, after getting into the code, ability to withstand the cross-examination, response to questioning, cross-examination, concentration, attention to be tested, ability to communicate, interaction with other peoples. So this consent for relationship has been assessed in a retrospective way, where we have to assess what people actually do when they have sex, mechanism of the act, and the risks of HIV, a chance of getting pregnancy, able to exercise the capacity that is the mental disorder should not make someone be unable to refuse. The presence of mental disorder doesn't mean that the individual is not giving consent or not giving capacity. That is a point in the 4 slides discussed. So that's all in the assessment group. And treatment is very simple. So after developing psychiatric morbidity, we have 2 options left out. One is psychotherapeutic treatment and another one psychopharmacological treatment. Acute phase, when like acute stress disorder, etc., we have some type of intervention psychologically, like crisis intervention, supportive psychotherapy, stress inoculation therapy can be tried. Stress inoculation therapy is a type of CBT where we can psychologically make the individual able to, this is similar to vaccination, so we able to tolerate the stress, think about the stress, and they can think what are the way they can prevent, what are the way it can occur. In that way we can give stress inoculation therapy. And cognitive behavior approaches to the individual. Exposure therapy can also be. Exposure therapy means psychological exposure, not in vitro exposure, and make the individual less vulnerable, which will be very helpful for phobia and PTSD. The same way EMDR can also be tried. Group therapy is very effective, but in India it is not very prevalent. Its group therapy should be initiated in India. Art therapy, dance, I'm telling group therapy for sexual abuse victims, not sexual abused victims, not in general. So for them group therapy is not well established one. So art therapy, dance, movement therapy, music therapy, all those things can be tried. Coming to the pharmacological treatment, though in acute phase, the individual doesn't require any pharmacological management except for the presence of use of benzodiazepines. But when they encounter with the chronic illnesses like depression, anxiety, OCD, or PTSD, then the appropriate drugs to be used like SSRI, TCAs, or mood stabilizers. Some rarely uses antipsychotics. So that's all from the victim aspect. Now we'll move on to perpetrators. So this is something new for everyone, because the previously discussed one, most of us would have studied in our textbooks or discussed from others, or when you used to write in a legal case sheet, you would have some idea. But this topic, which is very new to many people who are attending this session, yes, this is called perpetrators. Yeah, the term perpetrator refer to any person who commits a sexual assault, regardless of whether the victim is a minor or adult. So perpetrator can be from the family member, neighbor, from the occupational environment, stranger, anywhere. So perpetrator of an adult sexual assault has a slightly different characteristics than from a perpetrator of a child sexual abuse. I will discuss in detail about those things. So coming to perpetrators of an adult sexual assault, they will be major 2 broad headings. One is deviant sexual interest, that is sadomasochist, like that. And many of have cognitive distortions. They have cognitive distortion. What kind of cognitive distortion will have? For example, these kind of cognitive distortions are very, very common with the neighborhood sexual abuse, occupational sexual abuse like that. If a woman comes and talks closely, the particular individual will think, the men will think that this woman wanted to have a sexual relationship like that. So there are many distortions in the male dominant society. If women communicates freely or women comes along with for a function or party, they will automatically think that in a different way. And also women, these are some of the cognitive distortion I would given like women enjoy forced sexual activity only if the victim who has initiated the contact. Women control, reject and humiliate me. Committing a crime is a fair way to compensate for the past injustice. Like if they have a relationship, if they had a relationship and they left behind, and the individual will think that committing a crime is a good. So these kind of cognitive distortions make them to do a sexual assault or sometimes have deviant sexual interests. So the typology of the perpetrators, not you. It's very difficult for you to read all the point. I will highlight just the typologies of the perpetrators of a sexual assault against women. So there are 4 categories: compensatory type, sadistic type, angry and power control type, opportunistic type. Compensatory is nothing but they are incapable. They are having low self-esteem. So to overcome that, they will behave in this way to show that they are having a power. This kind is compensatory. Sadistic, of course, previously told, it is a deviant type of sexual behavior where the individual will do a violent behavior, violent acts, make humiliate the victim and get the pleasure. That is called sadistic. Angry and power control is the misogynistic. That is the patriarchal community where the individual will abuse substance and behave in a leader way that they will control the women. So in that way, angry group will be angry group typology. Now, opportunities are when available situations. Most of the opportunities are coming from the workplace. So these are the typologies like this: compensatory, sadistic, angry, and opportunistic. So these are the more major typologies of perpetrators in the adult group. Coming to the perpetrators of the child abuses, usually perpetrators of the child abuse will be called as pedophile. Simply, it is very common, pedophile. So I refer to an individual who is 16 years of age or older, who has an exclusive or non-exclusive sexual attraction to the prepubescent illness, usually of 13 years of age. So pedophile, these kind of pedophiles are categorized into 3 types. One is isolated pedophile, similar to the compensatory type in adults. Orderly pedophile, this is specific because in orderly pedophile, the individual will have a near normal life than anyone. So we cannot able to identify this orderly pedophile only very, very prevalent in our society among with our cousins, uncles, etc. So they are falls in the orderly pedotype. Festive pedotypes are rare individuals. They will seek immediate satisfaction. They will be using alcohol and drugs. Festive pedotype falls under sadistic category. Isolated pedotype is coming under compensatory category. So these are some of the characteristics individual, like poor social skills, feeling of powerlessness, low self-esteem, emotional attachment problem. So these are some of the personal characteristics of perpetrators. So apart from the individual perpetrator characteristics, there are characteristics in relation to the family, the society, and the community that I will discuss in the coming slides. And this slide, what are the strategies that has been used by the perpetrators to commit children sexual abuse? Yeah, they will create a state of emotional dependence for the children, and they will seduce, persuade, manipulate. They will games, they will start gradual desensitization, give gifts, privileges, threats, sometimes physical abuse. So these are the things that the strategies that has been used by the perpetrators for child sexual abuse. So apart from the individual factors that I've discussed in the previous slides, these are some of the family factors for the perpetrators. Yes, usually they will be associated with delinquent groups, violent family environment, poor support family, social isolation, patriarchal family. These are some of the factors. Community factors where there were poor employment, weak community sanction against them, gross general tolerance of the sexual assault within the community. Actually, I wanted to tell, this is the main reason why the adult sexual abuse has been not being talked about.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
You can continue. I think it was some disturbance.
Shabiba, can I continue?
Yeah, you can continue.
Okay. So general tolerance of sexual assault within the community, actually this is the main problem. Yes, because of this only the sexual assault is not coming out. everyone is talking about the child sexual abuse because POCSO Act has been made that it's a groundbreaking act which helped the child sexual abuser to get punishment in a quick way. But the same is not for the adults and other groups which I have mentioned. So this is the reason. General tolerance. So in some of the villages, they usually tolerate about this. And poor institutional support from the police and the judicial system. Poor institutional support from the police and the societal factors like high crime rate, social norms that perpetuate family inferiority, sexual submission, etc. High tolerance of crime and violence, social norms that support sexual assault similar way. So when you encounter a person, how do we know that that individual is a high risk of become a perpetrator? So some of the points which have history of high sexual offenses, previous criminal history, involvement of extra familial girls, incest history, palliametric evidence of pedophilic stimulation, palliametric evidence of response to non-sexual violences at the time of index offense, reduced self-esteem, impaired victim empathy, increased anger may be important. Being a victim in childhood is also an important factor. Presence of violent sexual fantasies, attitude of patient to the women, that what attitude the individual will have, attitude of patient to the sex with children, a presence of cognitive distortion, presence of comorbid mental illnesses, a cortical pathological changes, including temporal lobe changes, a diagnosis of LD or personality disorders have increased risk. So once you know about the characteristics of perpetrators, assessment. So in similar way to the victim, the assessment, usually the perpetrators will not come for the psychiatric evaluation because these individuals won't develop psychiatric illness. They will be coming through legal judicial system only for assessment. In that too, for an adult perpetrators, they will usually judicial system refers not for a mental health assessment. Usually they will refer for the assessment of impotence, that is the potency, whether the individual have potency or not, like that only they will assess. In the same way, for the juvenile nowadays, based on Juvenile Justice Act, they will started sending the patient for capacity assessment and know the consequences of crime. But for adults, they will only send the judiciary system only send for the whether the individual have potency or not. So, but still, when the offenders come for assessment, you should have a thorough history. Again, documentation is very important. You should assess for conduct disorder, PD, all these things, LD, element of organicity, substance abuse to be noted. Organicity is very important. Many times, temporal lobe disorders, the individual will have abnormal behavior, so you should assess in that way also. The list of psychological assessment, you should assess for sexual interest, distorted sexual attitudes and beliefs, social affective management, self-management, and battery of psychometric tests that has been developed within the sexual treatment evaluation project. There is a separate project which helps to assess the perpetrator specifically. Other physical instruments that can be used including phenyl plethysmography. It's currently the only objective means of assessing the pedophilic sexual interest is by directly measuring the phenyl erection in response to the stimulus. Abel assessment. Abel is a person who found a questionnaire pattern to assess the thought, fantasies, and behavior, and a computerized assessment of gaze time. Together with it gives more comprehensive knowledge about the perpetrators. Polygraph, it will be commonly used for in the judiciary system, can also be tried in this individuals. Visual reaction time is another thing. Visual reaction time is amount of viewing time spent looking at a particular image has been hypothesized as being non-intrusive method of measuring sexual interest based upon the notion that visual reaction time is an indicator of sustained sexual interest. So that this is the one I discussed in the previously. A mental capacity. There is no specific assessment for adult perpetrators based on any laws, usually assessed for impotence, that is psychological cause. Usually the report given by psychiatrists, there is nothing to suggest that he is not capable of performing a sexual act. That is a that is a sentence that usually we write when they come through urological assessment. It is not a direct from the magistrate, it will be referred from urologist. From juvenile justice, for juvenile cases, Juvenile Justice Act, they will there will be two categories. Everyone know that in that child in conflict with law, usually the magistrate refers for assessment of mental capacity to commit the heinous crime or capacity to know the consequences of crime. We have to assess the individual with basic all the thing, IQ, personality disorder, everything. But in turn, but at last we have to give a report that the individual have a mental capacity and the individual know the consequence also. In that way, we have to. Treatment of the offenders, which is not commonly done in India, but it is very prevalent in foreign countries, the surgical castration. This kind of technique is, though looks unethical, but this is a best treatment for them to prevent sexual violences, and other persons also will have fear. And hormonal treatments like gonadotropic drugs like medroxyprogesterone acetate, cyproterone acetate, and GnRH analogs like goserelin, lopirolide, all these drugs act to reduce the sexual drive in these individuals. A psychological treatment can be tried, which called aversion therapy, covert sensitization. Aversion, where the individual, after seeing images, we can give an electric shock. Covert sensitization through verbalization, verbalize the feeling of that sexual consequences, follow with a negative. We have to pair the negative consequences with that. Satiation therapy is another therapy where the individual have prolonged masturbation, thinking about that particular event, and which again cause the individual a delayed masturbation, make the individual less vulnerable to do the problems. So that's all in perpetrators. Now I will go to prevention. This is the only thing we can do for sexual abuse. So the prevention, that too a primary prevention is very, again I am telling the prevention which I am going to discuss is pertaining to psychiatry only. The prevention I am not telling in general. Though the primary prevention will be called it as general, the other preventions will be pertaining to psychiatry. So prevention, in prevention of sexual abuse, it is slightly different from our routine psychiatric prevention here, because the primary prevention, that is not to prevent the development of psychiatric illness, we have to prevent the sexual abuse itself. That is a primary prevention. Then secondary prevention, after the incident, that is after the trauma, we have to minimize the psychological consequences. That is secondary prevention. Tertiary prevention is to treat the full-blown psychological symptoms. That is called tertiary prevention. So here the primary prevention, there are some of the ways. Either you can prevent victimization, that is to prevent victim from getting abused, or you can prevent the perpetrators. Here in prevention, both the categories has been included, victim and the perpetrators, both group will be included. So preventing victimization, we can start from the school itself, school-based educational program, particularly to encourage assertive behavior, inform about the sexual abusive situation and their rights, counter certain popular myths and beliefs about abuse, encourage to disclose abusive situations. Maltreatment prevention programs like home visitation, parenting education program to improve their knowledge of the parents and the family members. Resistance and risk reduction strategies. This is very important because most of the women, they are not trained. The self-defense is not trained. But during the trauma, the individual doesn't know how to react, what to react. So, but still, if the individual have a self-defense and coping mechanism learning, they can escape from that particular areas. So if they know about the perpetrators' characteristics, they can also escape. So they should be aware about the sexual abuse, and they should not be over optimistic, because sometimes it's something, it's called misnomer. Women can be optimistic, but not in the sexual assault, because by crossing a road, we will cross a road with a slight fear that we will know that we cross the road, but still we have a small fear that if some vehicle will come and hit, so we have to cross the road in a proper way. In the same way, only sexual abuse to be taken into account. Though we are less likely to get harmed by anyone, but still we have a slight thought that what will happen if they harm us, like particularly in occupation, etc. So you should be very aware about this. So women should learn about self-defense, coping mechanism, marital arts, and the educational programs, particularly about myths about sexual assault, bolstering the women's sense of self-efficacy to be increased. In children, to the parent, we have to teach the safety, learn about the dangers of internet, be involved in children's life. The current pandemic era, many children has been not addressed by the parents, and the children's getting into an online society like anything. Screen time checking, supervising, communicate them, use the correct terms for the body parts, safe touch, unsafe touch, confusing touch, all should be discussed. Be emotionally available for your children all the time. And for the perpetrators, you have to prevent aggressive behavior. Children maltreatment program is again why I have added here, because the children sexual abused victim will be a perpetrator in a future. So that is a children maltreatment prevention program is a primary for them. school-based prevention program where we have to give a pro-social behaviors. We have to identify individuals and teach the pro-social behaviors and cognitive distortions to be addressed. Dating violence prevention program. This is very common. Young adults and adolescents during the dating period, that is when they engage in relationship, from the partner itself, the main problem occurs. So, the dating violation prevention program is very important. Recidivism, that is a repetition. Once the individual comment about the problem, once the individual commit the crime, the recidivism, repetition of the offenses to be prevented. That is the recidivism prevention program. So we should engage the community in primary prevention. So 4 steps for the community to engage in a primary prevention: identify the potential community partners, structure and keeping efforts, identify the community specific needs and risk factors, and the 4th step is responding to sexual violences. So these are some of the ways we have to respond to the sexual violence. Risk factors should be addressed, target the multiple levels of ecological model that has been discussed. Community ability to respond to sexual violence depends upon several factors. So first, the key institution is the area of medicine, law, and psychosocial service must be identified. The barrier to the effective response, whether the institutional, cultural, finance, which to be addressed. Finally, interlinking and mutually supportive approaches must be established to ensure that victims can navigate the system while being treated with dignity and respect. So the way: raising awareness, building network, integrating action, and consolidating the effects. This is primary prevention. Secondary prevention, that is after the trauma, individual level, we should increase the coping skills, give crisis intervention, meditation, join in groups. There are so many NGOs are out there to help such kind of victims, but many of us do not know about that. Supportive counseling for them. Family and friend support. The most important is social support has been the most crucial critical factor that helps in the rape survivor recovery processes. Of course, legal agencies. Tertiary prevention. After the onset of psychiatric illness, we have to address the psychiatric symptom, manage with early psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy, and follow-up visits, very, very important. So that's all. So to conclude, sexual abuse produces significant psychological symptom. The survivor were pursuing legal battle for justice, and them being suffering mental illness make it more difficult for them to put with the rigors of protracted court trial. Therefore, the mental health of the survivor needs a prompt addressal. Considering the high psychiatric morbidity in this population, it is justifiable that survivor be screened for psychiatric morbidities and indicated psychiatric intervention being advised by the specialist in the mental health. Evaluation and punishment to be very stringent for the perpetrators. So before completing I will put few slides in relation to the sexual abuse. See, these are the legal measures, sections, POCSO, sexual harassment for women. These are acts available. These are the programs and NGOs: Rakshin Project, Prostan UNICEF Project, Right Siren Project, Rahi, Arpan, Tarshi. These are some of the very good NGO projects in unison with UNICEF. There are so many projects available. These are some of the NGOs helping women to fight their rights, but many of us do not know. See, in different steps they will be helpful. For example, one NGO will help for rescue and legal intervention, one particularly for minor boys, one for gender equality, one for providing legal advices, one for giving sexual education. So there are so many NGOs available in India for helping this. And one more important thing to add is Me Too movement. Yeah, the Me Too movement was initiated by Tarana Brook in 2006. She's the first person to initiate this. But in India, it is by Tanushree Datta in 2018, where during that time, most of the people was telling about the Me Too movement, and they started coming out that most of them abused during their lifetime. And the last slide, Sexual Assault Awareness Month is SAAM. Is actually April. Every April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. This year the theme was "We Can Build Safe Online Spaces." We know the sexual assault from a stranger, sexual assault from the neighbors, abuse from the occupational areas, but the more problematic in the current era is online sexual abuse. So for that only, the current theme was "We Can Build a Safe Online Spaces." So that's all. Zero tolerance for sexual exploitation and abuse from WHO. So stop, prevent, and protect. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Shankar, for your extensive presentation. We have learned and we heard a lot of new things today from the usual psychosocial aspects of sexual abuse, where we talk about the depression, anxiety symptoms, and post-traumatic stress disorder. We also got to know things like the preventive
Hello?
measures.
Hello?
Can we, the host, mute the person who's speaking in between?
Hello? Hello, just a minute. I need one question, please.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Sir, my name is Suresh from Chennai. I'm also counseling psychotherapist, but I need some query.
Yes, sir. Sorry. Yes, sir. Please.
Okay, it is the sexual abuse most probably for having delayed marriage or what? How far it is happening, sir? It's based upon.
It's about the individual. It's about the individual and the sir. Yes, sir. It's about the individual and the family, sir. So it is about the individual and the family. If the individual will think this abuse, they can come out with a coping strategy and good support from their family members. They can get into a normal life like other ladies, other women, sir. But if they think it is a traumatizing throughout their life and they will have a repetition of symptoms like PTSD, then that individual will have very difficulty in getting into a new life, and of course that time there will be a delayed marriage.
Okay, sir. The prawn videos are creating sexual aversions. Likewise, any disease.
Pardon, sir, I am not able to understand your question. Pardon again.
Sexual. How should I say? If the sexual incompetence is to seeking for prawn videos, that is helpful to sexual abuser.
You mean they will become sexually incompetent after getting married, like that you are asking?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, it is one of the complications. It is one of the long-term complications where the individual will have a detrimental sexual life. Yes, individual who gone through a sexual trauma definitely will have a detrimental sexual life unless she has a good coping mechanism and support from the family and the legal system. Okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So, are there any other queries?
Yeah, Dr. Shavika, I have one query. I am Dr. Manoj, currently working as assistant professor in AIIMS Gorakhpur. First, I'm audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can go ahead.
First, I would like to thank Dr. Shankar for such a very exhaustive and very detailed presentation on a very important and sensitive topic. I have just one query, because since it's a very common issue that all we psychiatrists do face doing our practice also.